In this video, we will be looking at the fight to secure trade unions to improve the lives and conditions for workers in Britain. So far, we have been looking at the 19th century, and there are so many different political movements all happening at the same time, such as the Chartists, the Anti-Corn Law League, the Abolition Movement. Here, we're going to be looking at the fight to secure these trade unions. First of all, big question, what actually is a trade union? Well, a trade union is when workers join together and collectively fight for better pay and working conditions. During the Industrial Revolution, millions of people moved from the countryside into the new industrial cities to work in factories. Factory conditions were truly awful, as workers would be expected to work over 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, for low wages doing dangerous jobs where accidents were common. Workers realised that they had more chance of improving conditions if they worked together and organised themselves in a trade union. The main tool at the union's disposal was, of course, the strike, refusing to work until the employer agreed to fairer conditions. Now, trade unions were technically legalised in 1824, but the Combination of Workmen Act meant that they could only meet to discuss pay and working conditions, and that strike action was severely restricted. So unions could exist, but they were very weak and limited in their actual power. The government were actually quite scared of workers organising themselves because there's a fear that when workers get together, all they want to do is start a revolution. In fact, life for many workers was actually getting more difficult because of the rise of new technology. This made factories and farms a lot more efficient, but at the same time put jobs at risk and pushed wages down. Workers sometimes fought back violently. In the cities you have the Luddite movement, in which groups smashed machinery in cotton mills that they thought were taking their jobs. Today, if you call someone a Luddite, it's an expression meaning you're opposed to new technology or are slow to adopt it. In the countryside, you had the swing riots, in which local labourers would send threatening letters to their landowners signed by someone called Captain Swing. In the not too distant future, these farmers would break into the landlord's farm and smash the machinery. Now this brings me onto the famous story of the Tolpuddle Martyrs, who tried to form an early trade union. In 1834, a group of 6 labourers from a tiny village called Tolpuddle in Dorset saw their wages being cut by their local landowner. The men agreed to form a trade union to demand higher wages. They also swore a secret oath of loyalty to agree to this. Obviously, the landlord didn't like this, and he appealed to the authorities for help. Trade unions were legal, but swearing an oath was actually a criminal offence, and they used this as a very flimsy excuse to arrest these men. The Tolpuddle Six were sentenced to 7 years in Australia as forced labour. This was an extremely harsh punishment, and there was a very high chance that these men would die before they could return home. People back in Britain realised that this was an attack on the idea of trade union itself and were outraged. The government simply wanted to find any excuse they could to get rid of these men for forming a trade union. There was a huge outcry for justice, and over 200,000 people marched on Parliament with a petition of 800,000 names demanding their release. The massive unrest caused the government to reverse their decision, and in 1836 they pardoned the men who were allowed to return home. These men became known as the Tolpuddle Martyrs. Martyrs meaning they died for their faith, even though no one actually died. Anyway, huge win for the workers and the trade union movement. Now, I'll very briefly go through some of the key events of the trade union movements in the next 50 years. First up is a real mouthful, the foundation of the Grand National Consolidated Trades Union in 1834. This was an attempt to form a national union of all workers in all trades across the country. It had 500,000 members at its peak, but it only lasted less than a year because it was extremely difficult to coordinate as workers from different industries had completely different priorities. There was also conflicting interest between the skilled and unskilled workers. I'm not a big fan of these words as I find unskilled as slightly dismissive, so I'll call them low-wage workers, such as factory workers, dockers, railwaymen, and then you have higher-wage workers, and these are professionals like engineers, carpenters, machinists, who required specialised training and were generally better paid. These professions did not see themselves in common with the general working class in Britain. So, from the 1850s, the new model unions appeared for these high-wage workers, such as the Amalgamated Society of Engineers in 1851, followed by the carpenters in 1860 and the tailors in 1866. These unions were funded by regular subscriptions from its members and so were generally better funded, but these mainly fought for the middle classes with better paid jobs, and there was no movement really fighting for the general workers. This began to change in the late 1880s with the rise of the new Unionism movement, and there are two major events to learn. The first event is the Match Girls Strike of 1888. This took place at the Bryant and May matchstick factory in East London, where most workers were girls and women and forced to work long hours for very low pay. They also worked with a very dangerous substance called white phosphorus, which is actually banned in many countries, as its fumes would be inhaled by the workers and would cause a type of bone cancer known as phossy jaw, and even sometimes lead to death. A social reformer named Annie Besant published the story of the workers in a weekly journal called The Link, labelling them as the white slaves of London. The factory owners retaliated by making the workers sign a petition denouncing Besant's claims. When one worker refused, they were sacked, and triggered 1,400 workers to go on strike and call for wage increases and a safer workplace. After 5 weeks of strikes, the owners gave in to higher wages, and after a while, they banned the use of white phosphorus altogether. The second event is the 1889 dockers' strike in London. To give you some background of these dock workers, these were men who would load and unload ships along the River Thames, and they were known as casual labourers because they didn't have normal jobs. In the morning, they would rock up to the docks and have to compete with thousands of other workers for any sort of employment. Typically, they would receive very low wages, and they might have a job for the whole day, or it might be for an hour, or probably they won't get one at all. Poor wages and job insecurity pushed 20,000 dockers to go on strike in August 1889, calling for a minimum wage per hour and a minimum employment of 4 hours per day. Within a few weeks, they had brought the entire Port of London, the busiest port in the world, to a standstill, as London had been cut off from the British Empire. Sympathy strikes all over London, from postmen to railway workers, took hold. But even with their support, it looked like the employers were going to win. They planned to starve the workers out, which is a phrase meaning the employers were prepared to take a hit in the short term, but eventually the dockers will be forced to return to work if they simply have no money to survive. But out of absolutely nowhere, the dockers received a £30,000 gift from the trade unions in Australia, and meant that they could keep on striking for as long as they wanted. By September, the employers had backed down and agreed to the dockers' demands. Another win for these low-paid workers. So what then was the significance of the new unionism movement of the late 19th century? The Match Girls strikes and the dockers' strikes were the first time these general low-wage workers had tried to organise themselves and form unions. Between 1888 and 1891, thanks to these events, trade union membership doubled and continued to grow throughout the 1890s. The trade union movement also led directly to the creation of the Labour Party in 1893 to represent the interests of the workers in Parliament, and they also worked closely with these unions. And so this also turned into a political movement as well, as Labour became one of the most influential parties in British political history. But I definitely would never say that it was all wins for the workers. Usually, there was a decent chance that the employers would win the strikes by starving their workers out, and the gains made by the workers often tended to be short-term and limited. Although trade union membership grew throughout the period, by 1900 it still only represented around 10% of the workers in Britain. There was still a lot of work to be done for the trade unions during the 20th century. And in a later video, we will look at the general strike of 1926 and the miners' strike of 1984. See you then.